I'm thrilled to return to the topic of higher ed. And today we have a higher ed leader who is at the forefront of innovation. Pardis Mahdavi is a professor of anthropology at the University of LeMoine. Prior to this role, she served as president at the University of LeMoine, provost and executive vice president at the University of Montana, as well as dean at Arizona State University and the University of Denver, after serving in multiple roles at Pomona College. Her research interests include gendered labor, human trafficking, migration, human rights, and public health. In the context of changing global and political structures, and she's a widely published author. Pardis is a lifetime member of the Council on Foreign Relations and Young Presidents Organization and has been a fellow at the Social Sciences Research Council, the American Council on Learned Societies, Google Ideas, and the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. She also serves as a board member for the Lumina Foundation, our sponsor, and the Human Trafficking Legal Center. Welcome to Workforces, Pardis.
Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I am thrilled and honored to be here today.
Well, we're thrilled you could join us. And so as we get started today, Pardis, we'd love to learn more about your background and the story of your career path in higher education.
You know, interestingly enough, my story actually starts when I was a pretty young girl. I'm Iranian American, as my name suggests, and my parents came here during the revolution. I was initially born, I'm a child of the revolution, so maybe I'm dating myself, but I was born here. My parents, you know, they came here during the revolution, so I was born here in Minnesota. And we lived in Minnesota until I was about 6 years old. And one day I came home from school and there was a sign posted in front of my house and it said, "Burn this house, terrorists live here," which of course my Iranian American mind, my 6-year-old mind could not get my head around. I thought, you know, my dad is a doctor, my mom is a health provider. We are, you know, but this was, you know, Minnesota, you know, during Iran, you know, Iran-Contra, Iran hostage crisis. And so really growing up at a time of antipathy towards Iranians, right, in this country. And so my father made the very difficult decision to pack everything up once again and move from Minnesota to California. But my father said something to me in that move, and that's really what drives me, you know, in higher ed. He said, "You know, Pardis, people can take everything from you. They could take your belongings, they can take your home, they can even take your country. But the one thing nobody can ever take from you is your education." And that's really what drove me to understand the value of access to education, because no matter where you go, it was having that education that always opened up doors and opportunities. And, you know, for an immigrant family to be able to do all the things that we were able to do, it was education that allowed us to do that. And so that really propelled me to want to be, you know, part of making sure that everybody can access what can never be taken away from them. So that was really sort of my journey into higher education. School became my job. And I really, you know, it propelled me to becoming, you know, a leader in higher education because I saw, you know, the value, the power, and the importance of being able to access higher education. I also understood the role of education in upholding and supporting democracy. You know, coming from a place like Iran, I actually went back, you know, between 2000 and 2007. I taught there and really felt the weight of trying to be a part of higher ed in a place which is so heavily regulated. I thought, gosh, you know, there's so much we take for granted in this country. And the power of American higher education in upholding democracy is one that we can't lose. And so, you know, over my career trajectory, I watched as the perception of higher education for Americans has gone down. You know, as we sit here today, more than half of Americans believe college is not a good use of time. And, you know, we're facing the possibility that for the first time in American history, the generation that's coming up, my kids' generation, will be less educated than the generations that came before it. That is not a trend that we're bucking in the right direction. That to me is a national security crisis. It's a crisis of democracy. that keeps me up at night. And so really what I've always wanted to do is figure out ways of making higher education better and being able to both meet the needs of students and meet the needs of the democracy, which, of which workforce is a huge part of all of that.
So, in your journey in higher ed, in addition to, per your very impressive resume, you've worked with many different kinds of higher ed institutions, and I guess I'm really interested in understanding, kind of your take on the state of higher ed with respect to that national security and democracy and workforce development issue, and then segue to really what is the problem that you are now looking to solve for as you've stepped away from higher ed
Yeah.
or being a higher ed president.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I think for a long time, the conversation in higher ed was about access, right? It was how can we get as many people to be able to access as possible? And then we talked a lot about attainment. How can we make sure people are finishing, that they're not stopping out, And now we're talking a lot about narrating the importance and the value of higher education. And I think one of the things I've observed, and as you mentioned, I've been at, top 10 small liberal arts college. I've been at America's largest university, ASU. I've been at the land grant, Montana. I was president of a Hispanic serving institution, private in Los Angeles. And one of the common themes I see is that there is this absolute disconnect between what students are demanding from the higher education experience, right? So you've got students saying, hey, we want to be trained with, technologically enhanced learning. Coming out of the pandemic, we see students are more risk averse than ever before. We see that lecture is dead, no more chalk and talk. And we see students asking for engaged and experiential learning, very clearly asking for these things and saying, help us connect the dots, help us to develop, we're working so hard developing that pipeline from K-12 into college. Now we've got to help develop that pipeline, connecting those dots from college to career, right? What does that look like? And how do you start to render that legible? Not to say that there isn't a role for liberal arts, but it's a larger picture, and students are asking for, legibility. They're asking for curricula that have both horizontality and verticality to it. They're very clear on what they're asking for. And on the other end, workforce is very clear on what they're asking for, right? They're asking for students who are able to be critical thinkers, problem solvers, effective communicators, having certain skills. And yet, you've got kind of higher ed sitting right here, not necessarily making the changes or being responsive to the needs of, and again, we wouldn't ever narrate students as customers, but to the needs of the people who we're trying to serve. We're trying to serve students, and we're trying to serve the democracy. And so the question is, how can we best do that? We've seen in the last decade or more the emergence of ed tech as a field, right? Educational technologies, technologically enhanced learning, things like virtual reality. We know that they are incredibly effective for learning outcomes, right? I think about, at Arizona State, Dreamscape Learn is a VR modality that was deployed for gen ed classes like Biology 101. And the results were staggering. Students were retaining much more of the material. Students who were neurodivergent or from diverse backgrounds, English as a second language, they were all doing much better. So the data are clear that technologically enhanced learning modalities both help meet students' needs and also help students develop a skill set that they can translate to workforce. And yet, higher ed is sort of sitting here in this moment of, oh my gosh, there's these different needs being articulated. There's a whole slew of possible solutions. And I think that what's happening is that it's becoming increasingly difficult for us in higher ed to have the conversations that we need to have, because it's become so politicized, it's become so fractured, and we've lost the focus on service and on serving our role, and we've lost that mission focus of sort of serving students and serving the democracy.
Yeah, we are in the middle of a very complex landscape, and I'm curious to hear more about your thoughts about what are the ways forward, right? Like at a time of so many kind of competing, I wouldn't say priorities, but competing needs, or maybe different levers that are being pulled. And, how do we serve both the needs of students and the needs of industry and make sure, higher ed is fulfilling its mission. And higher ed, of course, very broadly defined, right? It looks very different in different places, but
100%.
what do you see as some ways forward in this complex space?
And again, you don't want to say something is a magic bullet, let alone do you want to say technology is a silver bullet that's going to solve everything, right?
Yeah.
But I do think that, in higher ed, we're finally starting to feel the very real tensions between an ecosystem that has, even though you have the protections of tenure, has been a bit risk averse, right? And I think one of the reasons that Arizona State has been so successful in innovation is that there is a very high tolerance for failure. There's an ecosystem where there's a high tolerance for failure, so that experimentation is kind of it's sort of the coin of the realm, right? Mm-hmm. Experimenting, because high fidelity to I always talk about myself as, when I was a president, high tolerance for failure, high fidelity to data. You do your homework and then you start to experiment. And we're in this moment where there has been a flourishing of ed tech. There has been a flourishing of technologies like, just at the very basic level, Chat GPT, right? And learning how to teach with these technologies really requires us to have some hard conversations about what is the infrastructure that's necessary in higher ed to create a sustainable architecture where technology can enhance learning and allow us to meet the needs of students and employers. And so that's what I'm doing now. My colleagues and I, we've started our own consulting project, EES Associates. And what we're trying to do is actually help leaders in higher education figure out first, what are the technologies that, as you mentioned, Kaitlin, universities are different. It's not a one size fits all, right? And so something that's going to work for Arizona State, something like Dreamscape Learn, which is, scalable, big, that's going to meet that population of over 100,000 students, is not going to fit for Pomona College, right, which has less than 2,000 students. But that's not to say that Pomona College can't benefit from technologically enhanced learning, right? And so actually places like Pomona are great places to have those conversations about technologies like ChatGPT and, what are the ethics? How do we think about it? How can we study it and then use it as a problem solve? Other people have used this, analogy. It's sort of like when the calculator was invented. At first, math teachers were like, how are we ever going to teach math? And now, of course, we can't imagine teaching math without calculators. Someday we won't be able to imagine teaching many subjects without ChatGPT, but we still have to learn and harness. And so, there is a place for different institutions to plug in. And so what we do is we try to figure out, okay, what's the best technology to meet your needs? And also, what is your unique skill set as a college or a university or an ed tech group? What is your unique skill set where you can serve this larger mission of kind of cracking this code of what do we do to continue to make higher education relevant for workforce, relevant for student needs, ultimately relevant for social mobility, right? Because social mobility is really what all of this is about. So we help match what the right technologies are with the right institutions. And then I think even more importantly, we help to make those technologies sustainable, because sitting in the seats that I've sat in, dean, provost, president, we all know that sometimes we go with a one-off and we spend lots of money and say, okay, we're going to use this software or we're going to use this and this is going to be our magic bullet, but we don't make it sustainable. We don't make it a sustainable part of our ecosystem. And so it just becomes an add-on, or it just becomes something that is a point of frustration, either for the leadership or for the faculty who are like, how am I, because we don't build the ecosystem to support it. So for example, we say, the pandemic was a great example. We're like, okay, everybody has to now teach online. Now, the institutions that succeeded at that were the institutions, again, like ASU, that had an infrastructure that said, look, teaching online isn't just about turning your camera on. There is an art to it, and we have a team of instructional designers who are going to help you, right? We have a team of people who have this expertise, and we're going to leverage that. So I think, we're at this moment now where we have technologies it's really about building that bridge and figuring out how to harmonize what higher ed does really well with what ed tech does well, and then figuring out what the sweet spot is to serve the needs of students and the democracy, broadly speaking, workforce being one component of that.
Yeah, it's very exciting, Pardis, and for sure the technology does offer all these new tools that we've never had before to make these connections and really begin to bring the people what they're clamoring for. I guess I'm interested to hear a little bit about. Well, I love that you're thinking about your practice in terms of, kind of focusing on, the superpowers of each of your partner institutions. Who can drive this? I mean, you're talking about presidents, provosts. I mean, where would you begin? I mean, obviously coming in
Yeah.
as a senior leader, I guess, is
Yeah.
the top, but I'm interested to hear you riff on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, and thanks for allowing me to kind of think into that with you. I think one of the pitfalls that often happens is that these initiatives and efforts are often driven by the IT office, right? The tech office thing, or offices outside of academic affairs. And so then it's just seen as well, that's an IT issue, that's not us, or, how do we fit it in? And I think where you see the most success is when it's both top down and bottom up, right? And I think it's where you see the most success is where you have leadership that says, yes, I want to innovate, right? I want to do this. And I want the buy-in, from all parts of the house. Because if it just becomes one more thing that, a provost has to make the faculty do, I mean, that's not going to work. And if it's just one more thing we pile on the plate of a faculty, I was that faculty member. At one point, when I was at Pomona, at one point, I was chairing 2 departments, teaching a full load, directing an institute. And I had, 3 young kids at the time. I mean, it just was not sustainable, right? So you can't, and so I think about, the 2016 version of me of Pardis. And I think if my dean or president was like, okay, well, now you have to teach with this technology. I mean, I would have just exploded, right? Or imploded. But if my dean or my president had come to me and said, we have this offering, we have this team of instructional designers. And actually, for me, the biggest kind of aha moment for me was having gone from being at Pomona, where there was 0 online teaching, and I was like, oh my God, that's a huge lift, to then actually teaching online at ASU. I suddenly realized, oh my gosh, so much of my time was freed up. I remember I had this semester where I was fully teaching online, right? And, you can be anywhere in the world. So, and my PhD is in anthropology. I suddenly realized I could be doing field, like it actually opened up time, and I could be grading, at 10 o'clock at night when my kids went to sleep, or I could be recording. I remember I was recording a lecture at like 11 p.m. when my kids went to sleep. It meant that I could be home with them during the day. It actually opened up more time and possibility, but no one had narrated it to me like that before, when I was at Pomona. And importantly, no one had given me the resources, the scaffolding to support that, right? So I was suddenly much more open to it because it was supported, and it was somebody, sat with me and, walked me through it. And it actually opened up more time for me. And that was such an aha moment, because for 11 years, I'd been a faculty member at a small liberal arts college thinking, holy moly, absolutely not. I could never teach online. That seems like totally out of the realm of possibility. That's just one more thing. And then when I did flip to teaching online, I thought, this is magic. I suddenly have so much more time, right? And it was just kind of getting over that hump. But I think what you can't, as a provost, what I could not expect my faculty, I put on my provost hat at Montana. As a provost, I could not in good faith go to my faculty and say, okay, now you all have to teach online, without saying,
Right.
okay, here are all the ways we're going to support you. Here's the scaffolding. I think you just have to approach it with intentionality.
Well, right. And my brain is going in a lot of directions right now, but I think you're saying so many things that are prompting different thoughts. But I think, one thing that just sticks out to me is, it's like with education, with ed tech, there's so much opportunity, but it's also like, what's the unique problem we're trying to solve, right? And making sure that the technology that you're bringing in is solving the challenge that your students are facing, or that your institution is facing, or that your faculty are facing, because otherwise it can feel, instead of, like an opportunity, as you're saying, it can feel like a burden or
Yeah.
an additional barrier.
Right, right. And I think at that macro level, I think the problem we're trying to solve is articulating and narrating the value of what we're doing. And I think is also, you know, being what education is, which is the great equalizer. And I think now that we know the power of technology in leveling the playing field, right?
Yeah.
It, it's almost unconscionable for us to not use it. Like if there is something that starts to close equity gaps, why would we stratify them by only allowing certain people and certain institution access to a technology that we know can enhance learning for, let's say, traditionally underrepresented or historically excluded populations? It's unconscionable for us to turn a blind eye to that.
Yeah, it sure is. So you're touching on so many critical aspects of what it takes to do this work, and I'm interested to hear, Pardis, based on your lessons learned, what are practical steps our audience can take to become forces in the future of higher ed?
I think a lot of it is that kind of deep listening, and we all know it's out there, right? And I think that there has sometimes in some cases been a bit of a stigma from, it's I'm happy to hear that we talk about workforce development, right? I mean, we've discussed this, but it used to be on the fringes, and it used to be like
Right.
if you talk about workforce in a higher ed setting, I mean, that's it. You're out of
Right.
the club. You're canceled. You're out of the club. And yet, that's, if you think about, again, the mission of higher ed, why higher ed was started, that's such a critical part of it. So, I think that deep listening to what are the demands of workforce, of the democracy, and what are the demands of students. So if we go back to that technology piece, workforce is saying we want students that are fluent in different types of technology. So not only does technology become an equalizing modality of teaching, but it becomes an equalizing currency, if you will, so that students graduate with a skill set that's very much in demand for our society and for our workforce. So back to your very, very good question, Julian, of like what can be done. I think it's really building those bridges. So building, and I know that that's a lot of the work you all are doing, is building the bridges between higher ed and workforce. And I'm trying to build the bridge between, students' demands and higher ed, as well as the bridge between, you've got all these technological solutions and higher ed, right? Where it's like, this doesn't have to be so hard. There are ways to actually make things easier. And rather than sitting there and doing, long division by hand, let's start using some calculators here, and figuring out how we can prepare students to meet the needs for workforce, but also how we can meet students' needs, how we can actually capture their attention, and engage them, I would say. I think that deep listening to what the demands are, rather than just saying, we have a product, it's tried and tested, 100 years we've been teaching this way. I think we're at a moment where we can do some deeper listening and say, okay, you know what? Maybe we're falling short, and wow, there's all these solutions out there. How can we live into our mission here of supporting our students while also fulfilling our role to uphold the democracy?
Yeah, and then I guess the piece that also Kaitlin and I spent a lot of time thinking about and trying to build into our own work and consulting is how do we make sure that this movement for this forward movement isn't just another flash in the pan fad? Because I do think a lot of times, these things kind of come and go with charismatic leaders or grants, and so how do we make it stick? And I think you're getting at it through the listening, and through the sort of more holistic and institution-wide approach.
Yeah.
Interested to hear your thoughts though about like how do we make sure this sticks, especially now that you're joining the consulting world. How do we as helpers and facilitators leave our colleagues in the institutions with a new way?
Yeah. I think first and foremost, the hallmark of a good consultant is that you get in, you set something up, and then you leave and it's running where they're not dependent on any of us. I mean, that's
Right.
that to me is like the hallmark of a good consultant. You come in with
Here,
an
here.
offering, you build it, and I know this is what you all do too. You help to build an ecosystem that runs, as opposed to them suddenly being dependent on you. You say, look, here's the way to make it sustainable. I think that's so key. So we talk about the deep listening. I think having the commitment to creating a sustainable infrastructure where that's how you take it from being a fad, right? So that's how you go from, okay, well, everybody else has VR goggles, I guess we should, I always use the analogy of the climbing wall, where it was like, well, all the other universities had climbing walls, so now we need a climbing wall so students can see it on their tour. Well, like, what's the purpose of that? You got to narrate the value of that, right? I mean, that's a little bit different. But with technology, rather than being like, look, I remember at a certain point, maker spaces was all the rage, right? Everybody had to have a maker space.
Right.
Okay, but how do you build that into the entire ecosystem? How do you build that into classes? With technologies like virtual reality, again, that's why I admire what Arizona State University did. They said, we're going to take this incredible technology that has this incredible power, and we're not going to start with like the electives that like a few people take. We're going to go in with Bio 101, and we're going to make it part of Gen Ed, and I think that's the difference. That's what makes something sustainable, because that is then now something that's central part of the ecosystem. The worst thing that can be done is, okay, we're going to set up an institute to do that. Right. I mean, and we saw that, we've seen waves of that. There was a wave of everybody had a cybersecurity institute. There was a wave of everybody had a human rights institute. Everybody had a diversity. That was the narrative around like a diversity officer. It's like, you can't put all of that on one person or on an institute. It has to be baked in. You have to empower your diversity. I mean, I have so much respect for chief diversity officers, because and the ones where they're super successful are the ones where the president has empowered them to be, transforming the entire ecosystem. One thing Pomona did really well was say, okay, diversity is going to be a strategy, a hiring strategy, but we're also going to bake it into our tenure and promotion processes. So again, it's really about how you kind of bake it into your ecosystem. The worst thing you can do is have it be an add-on where you're not supporting it with resources for implementation, and you're not actually articulating how and why it's central to the mission of the institution.
What's your perspective on the fact that everything in our landscape is moving so quickly? Economic changes are happening so quickly, and something like spinning up, as you said, the theme of spinning up cybersecurity institutes. Well, how do we respond quickly while also trying to bring a whole institution along with us?
Right.
How do you move quickly to implement these initiatives when you're also trying to, build momentum across, hundreds or thousands of faculty and staff?
As an anthropologist, I'm sure we've all heard the phrase, culture eats strategy for breakfast, right?
Yeah.
And I think that there is a prescience to that phrase, because I think you begin with culture, and I know we touched on that, but I think in order to be able to be nimble, I think you have to create a culture of nimbleness. And I think that there are institutions. Southern New Hampshire is another great example. Another fantastic example is National University, right? You've got these great examples of places where they've really made innovation a part of the culture, and they've made nimbleness a part of the culture. And so, I remember when I was at ASU, there was a joke. People would say, well, if you don't like an initiative at ASU, just wait 10 minutes and it'll change, and that wasn't necessarily a pejorative thing. It was like, no, right. Well, look, we're going to try these things. And what's great is that some of them really work. Dreamscape Learn really worked. Having a school for the future of innovation in society. I mean, when that was stood up, was super forward thinking. It really worked, right? And so actually committing at all levels and from the top all the way to, every staff member, every faculty member, it becomes a part of the culture. And so I think narrating the importance of nimbleness, to your point, in articulating, this is a fast-paced environment we're in, and I think actually calling that out, right? It's a fast-paced environment we're in. And that can sort of be a little bit jarring. Coming back though to that anchoring touch point of, and the students need us, like
Mm-hmm.
the students need us to be these anchors and to do right by them. So we need to shift our culture a little bit so that these different strategies can grow and flourish quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And we
Right.
also need to be like, it comes back to what I was saying about high tolerance for failure. We need to be okay with an initiative that maybe didn't work,
Yep.
right? And to say, you know what, we thought this would be a good idea. It didn't work. We're going to sunset it and we're going to morph it into something else. I
Yep.
think being able to sit with that and be okay with that is also a really important part of the culture.
So yeah, I think that theme of baking in the initiative, kind of regardless of what of I guess what you're alluding to here, regardless of what the initiative is exactly about, baking it into the strategy and baking it into kind of the culture of the place and the prioritization of that initiative within the space is critical. And we really appreciate you calling that out as a key element of how we all become forces in the future of this work, whether from a consulting standpoint or being a leader or actor in the future of higher ed. Pardis, I'm curious, how can our listeners learn more and continue to follow your work?
Oh, well, thank you for that. Reach out to me. I'm very easy to find on social media. Email me. EES Associates will send you our link. This was something we're doing now. Particularly a lot of institutions overseas are really asking for our help because they are, wanting to take bigger risks, as they start to grow. And I would say reach out to us any time. I mean, this is something, I'm so passionate about wanting to figure out ways of serving and making higher ed better. It did require me really stepping down from my leadership role to be able to actually feel like I could live into my purpose, which was to spread the message of, hey, there's a different way of doing things and we can serve a lot more people if we just allow ourselves to have the conversations. And you know what? Like sometimes we have to sit in the fire of discomfort. Like it may be that, yes, it's not the most comfortable first conversation to have, with colleagues to say, okay, we're going to try something new. I'm the first to admit that. But there are ways into that. And there are ways into, hey, this could make your life easier while also serving, students and the democracy. And let's face it, we're all here because we want to serve students, because we love our students, and because we love the contribution that we make to society. And so I think the entry point, the intentionality with which you bring to these difficult conversations, and just recognizing, calling them out, like, look, I recognize this is not easy. And I recognize higher ed is in a moment of reckoning. So we have a choice. We can lead the pack and we can lead and be a part of the problem solve and actually, keep higher ed as this important bedrock of democracy. Or we can kind of do, a freeze response of like, there's just too much coming at me. So I'm incredibly passionate about this because I've seen the problem, I've seen the solutions, and I just want to start building the bridge.
Well, you're a fantastic messenger. You're so honored and lucky to have you here and, helping you to spread that message, and look forward to continuing to look at ways that we can push this forward together. Really, thank you so much for this.
Thank you so much for having me here, and thank you for the great work that you all are doing. It's incredibly inspiring. It's an honor to be here in conversation with you both.
I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.